Hello, my name is Fayaz Rashpari with Gigamon, and today I'll be talking about uniting security operations, democratizing security intelligence. Happy to be here, and let's move on. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk about the shared responsibility model and talk about how that affects customers and organizations. And then we'll get into data elements of what it takes to actually understand the data that comes across the shared responsibility model and move into how this aligns with your security operations center. And then moving into how Gigamon can help with uniting security operations with data coming from both Gigamon, Threat Insight, as well as Sumo Logic. So when we look at the shared responsibility model, it's actually categorized in three different forms and entities. And if you think about, what responsibility the customer has versus what responsibility the cloud has, it's not as easy as just saying, hey, I'm going to go to the cloud and I don't have to worry about anything, right? So if you kind of look at, in this approach, typically most customers will, and have started to at least, look at various different cloud providers to definitely offload capabilities or the burden, I would say, to not just use their own physical data centers. Pretty normal use case where they want to start looking at SaaS providers, whether it's software as a service or platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, and start utilizing host or network resources and data centers that are there, whether it's AWS or Google or Azure. There is definitely a cloud shift. Where it gets interesting is as you move up the picture of the diagram, is when you look at operating systems through identity, it becomes a varied by nature of what customers are doing and where the responsibility model shifts to. A lot of it ends up becoming where it's a hybrid approach where some of it falls on the cloud providers and some of it falls on yourself. So now if you look at the top side, all of the responsibility actually ends up becoming the customer, regardless of where it sits. So you can have your information and data, all of your devices, your accounts and identities completely cloud, right? But what about the security around it? Whose responsibility is if you get breached and if there was information that was there in these cloud environments, right? So there are certain protections that cloud providers provide, but ultimately it is the customer's responsibility, and it's retained by the customer around the data of the data in the cloud environments and devices and the accounts and identities. So moving into those data elements, like what are those data elements? If you look at those data elements and categorizing that from a security perspective, it really comes down to atomic indicators of compromise and computed indicators of compromise. And if you think about what atomic really means, it's essentially it is what it is. There's no computation around it. It's essentially an IP address is what it is. There's no derivative around that IP address. The domain name is what it is, URLs and so on and so forth. The username is what it is. Versus the computed indicators of compromise, this is essentially a derivative or an algorithm that was used to get to that value. So that is a computed ILC. Both in its nature are instrumental in driving security operations and required, but just different forms of indicators, whether they're file hashes or SSH keys, NTLM used for user authentication, or JA3 is used for fingerprinting communications from a network, to other ones that are interesting that come specifically from Gigamon Threat Insight are observations and analytics that are also coming from our analytics that we do from our applied threat research team, and then also the detections that come out of Threat Insight, right? These are computed indicators of compromise. So moving into the data elements, right, and the question really becomes like, well, where do I get this stuff? Like, how do I, how do I make, it's one thing to have all this, understanding of the data, but, I still need to get to this. I need to get my hands on it and do analysis of this data to move um, to some understanding of what is in my environment. So moving into the SOC visibility triad, right? So if you look at the SOC visibility triad, many have heard of this, the triad. Essentially, it comes down to network and network security types of capabilities, as well as just in general security capabilities, right? So if you look at the foundation on the bottom there, you've got your endpoint detection and response, which essentially gives you a way to get introspection into your endpoints, like your laptops, your desktops, your servers, and getting further evidence as a system, whether is under attack or was breached or compromised. Analysts typically draw towards EDRs these days to be able to get that information and go to next steps of analysis, to triage, to next steps of even incident response if they require it, and understanding if a breach has occurred and moving to next steps of remediation, right? But then again, it comes with a whole slew of problems, right? What if that agent isn't installed on the endpoint, or an agent goes rogue? What if an attacker gets on the system and they disable the agent? Or if it just gets corrupt? Just dynamic nature of endpoints is that, right? It can go corrupt. Or, I have a Mac, and that Mac is on a unsupported operating system, and now I cannot install an agent, or IT cannot install an agent because it's not supported, right? Those are some of the issues that you come across with EDR solutions. And then moving into the SIM, right? The SIM can have its own slew of problems where you've got unsupported formats, parsing issues, tool sprawl. A log can be disabled by an attacker, but all essentially important. Not saying that it's not needed. Both are very essential in the security operations and from an incident response perspective. It's just that you require more. That's where the NDR solution comes in as well, right? You've got an NDR solution like ourselves, and we're a guided SaaS NDR called Threat Insight, which essentially we provide the layer 2 to layer 7 metadata to help augment security teams, providing that passive monitoring all the way to layer 7. And essentially, the key around here is working with the SIMs like Sumo Logic, and making sure that our NDR data, getting data from EDR providers, and then also getting data from our own sensor network and our telemetry, and passing it over to Sumo Logic, and also making sure that other data is also feeding into a SIM, and making it that much more impactful. So the key here is that this is great, right? But it takes time. The triad takes time, unfortunately. It's not as easy as let's just get it up and running and we're good. There's an integration aspect to it, right? So how do we kind of integrate, and how do we make this work and get quicker value, and get this up and running as soon as possible without the time burden to it, right? The other thing that I'll mention is also the SOAR aspect, which Sumo Logic, of course, we're partnered with Sumo Logic, and it's great to be able to have this partnership, to be able to work in numerous forms and fashions. Is that we can provide the integration from both sides, right? Considering that Sumo has both SIM and SOAR capabilities, and then now it becomes even more interesting because now with this data, we can essentially take and provide the network telemetry and enrich your SOAR and SIM, and provide those actions back as needed. So you can, the SOC and the operations teams and the incident responders can then move forward to next steps, not just from the identification of an attack, but also the containment and remediation and resolution of an attack. So let's take a look at some use cases. There's really two modes of operation when it comes to Threat Insight and Sumo Logic. And essentially that is that Threat Insight as a network detection response solution can be deployed across your network, regardless of whether it's north-south traffic or east-west traffic. So we want to be able to capture all traffic, and we want to be able to play strategically in one's network so that we can not only understand attacker adversary behavior as data is leaving outside of your company, but we also want to understand the soft and GUI middle, right? Basically being able to capture lateral movement, anything that goes between the beginning stages of reconnaissance all the way to exfiltration and impact. So as we're doing this, we're collecting network telemetry, we're getting event data, but then we're also utilizing our GTI threat analytics capabilities and doing further analytics and modeling this data and providing detections. And before detections actually occur, we actually do something called observations. So we can not only provide the events in raw that we essentially are posting to Amazon S3 buckets that are available to our customers, but then Sumo Logic can essentially take those and bring those in to the platform to make more sense of it. So not only does it give you context and enrichment, but then moving forward with our signals architecture, we're actually doing some of that work already, right? So rather than just giving you pure event telemetry, how nice would it be if Sumo Logic is already getting the observations that we have seen from our analytics, and then furthermore doing the aggregations for the analysts and just showing that in one pane of glass in the Sumo Logic SIM, and then taking the appropriate actions via the SOAR capability. So let's move on to what this really looks like. So if we look at the Sumo Logic with the Gigamon Threat Insight Signals dashboard here, you're seeing a few different representations of this, right? So number one being you've got the events that I talked about earlier, right? Those are just events coming from our sensors as they're deployed in a customer network, and essentially giving you not only counts, but these are all drillable actions, right? So you can get into how many connections were created, but then what were those connections? And then also how many detections came out of our sensor network in the environment, and then also moving into just raw data like DNS or other application layer data that could be interesting, HTTP requests, the URLs that we're seeing, what were the counts of the URLs and who made those calls, what were the endpoints, etc. So just giving you that additional understanding, which is paramount in a security operations team. Moving further to the actual specifics of what this looks like and giving a visual around it is also important to understand. Okay, well, hey, most of my traffic is DNS traffic. What is it DNS traffic? Who is it? Who's calling what? And it helps in both filtering specific data types and filtering specific domains. If you know that this is just an innocuous domain, this is normal traffic, let's not look at this unless it's specifically filter. We're providing that data, and then Sumo Logic can help with filtering that down with specific queries within the Sumo Logic interface as well. And then lastly, the observations, right? The observations are the actual analytics that I was talking about earlier that are coming from Gigamon Threat Insight. These become very important because these could be used as hunting leads as well as instant response situations where you're finding something and all of a sudden you're validating that, okay, well, that new and unusual NTLM authentication is not only unusual, but it actually is malicious because that new authentication is no one in my organization, and it's someone that has created a new account because another account was possibly compromised. And now a new login has occurred, and this is something that I need to look at further, right? Other things like fileless remote service creation, like what if a service was created without any files and maybe a memory-based attack or something that happened in a container environment, right? So being able to get visibility in that becomes is extremely important before a detection even happens, right? So being proactive about it, either being proactive about it via doing a hunt or just understanding your network. If it is actually valid, then making sure that, okay, this is valid, I can just deprioritize this and move on to the next thing because we know that this is something that maybe a development team created and it's used for a certain application. Digging a little bit deeper, right? So what do those use cases look like as we drill in, right? So the nice thing about the dashboard is that all of those items that I was talking about earlier, an analyst can actually drill in and understand, okay, well, I want to understand more so around the detections that have triggered from threat aside and who and what is it, right? So having that capability of having all types of data points coming in from Threat Insight, as well as other data points coming in into Sumo, we can now do some immediate correlation and tell a story, right? So let's take, for example, the first one, detections that have triggered from Threat Insight. Who and what is it? What if we were able to do an aggregation? And that's been done, right? So those predefined aggregations are already there, where we're creating the detection log and providing an aggregation with a source IP, right? And providing you that detail. What if you had a lead that there was a phishing attack occurring and there was a phishing campaign in the environment, and I wanted to know who was targeted, right? So wouldn't it be helpful if we can get the HTTP logs, the URLs, and look at those top URLs, and look at who was affected, the host, the system name, and the IP addresses, and move to next steps of an investigation. And then moving down further, right? It's not just about the network layer, but then also moving down further down to the host layer. So regardless whether it's coming from the Threat Insight signals, we can also do the aggregation with that NTLM log that we're providing, but then doing the aggregation and getting that username and providing that detail of, okay, well, here's the username that was affected, here's the host name, here's the NTLM log, and here's exactly what time it occurred, right? So that becomes extremely important. And then lastly, of course, as you move to the right of MITRE ATT&CK, I didn't really splash MITRE ATT&CK, but most will be familiar with MITRE ATT&CK if you live in security operations world, is that ultimately you want to stop exfiltration from happening, or you want to at least stop the bleeding if it's actually occurred, and make sure communications are cut off, right? Typical behavior of adversary activity is that this activity is encrypted, right? So that's where SSL logs become extremely important. If it's not encrypted, then of course you could still be looking at that. Maybe it's FTP data. If somehow they were actually exfiltrating via FTP, sure, then that can also be done. But typically most adversary behavior is in an encrypted channel. So let's look at those logs. Let's look at SSL logs, understanding who those hosts were, what those IP addresses were. Both source and destination IPs become important, and understanding when that happened and how large those packets were, right? Even though the data is encrypted, understanding the largeness of the packets, understanding when the packets were going out, if it were happening at a unique time of the day where normal business operations aren't active, then that can also trigger off something that could be something that a security team needs to look at. So I'll end right there, and I think that's pretty much it. Hopefully this was helpful, and excited to go on this journey with Sumo Logic and help our customers really in their security operations and help them unite all forms of data, whether it's coming from Threat Insight or Sumo Logic. We're excited to work on this together and move towards a more robust security operations team. Thank you.